At 12:30 p.m. on the 22nd of November, 1963, in the back seat of a moving presidential limousine on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, Jacqueline Kennedy reached across her husband's body and climbed onto the trunk of the car. The world has seen the photograph. Most people who have seen it assume they understand what it shows. They do not. What the photograph shows what Secret Service agent, Clint Hill, who was running toward the car from the follow-up vehicle, testified that he witnessed is a 34-year-old woman in a blood-soaked pink Chanel suit reaching for a piece of her husband's skull that had landed on the trunk of the limousine. She was not trying to escape. She was trying to keep him whole. Clint Hill reached the car. He pushed her back into the seat. She did not resist. She sat down. She pulled her husband's head into her lap, and she held it there with her hands, applying pressure to wounds that the medical training she did not have told her instinctively to cover for the 8 minutes it took the limousine to reach Parkland Memorial Hospital. When the car arrived, when the doctors came running, when the trauma team that had been alerted converged on the vehicle, Jackie Kennedy would not let go of her husband's head. The medical staff asked her to release him. She would not. She was holding the pieces of him together with her bare hands, and she did not let go until a nurse found a sheet and placed it over him, giving her a way to release him without watching what releasing him would reveal. This is the moment that the history books have always described as Jackie Kennedy's composure, her dignity, her grace. I want to offer you a different frame. What happened to Jacqueline Kennedy between 12:30 p.m. on the 22nd of November, 1963, and approximately 2 a.m. on November 23, the hours in which she refused sedatives, refused to change her clothes, refused to leave the casket, and then sat down and planned one of the most watched funerals in human history, is not a story about composure. It is a story about what a human being does when the world they have built disintegrates around them in the space of 6 seconds. And what Jackie Kennedy did in those hours, in those decisions, in the specific, documented details of what she refused and what she insisted on and what she said and what she left behind, tells you more about who she actually was than the mythology she spent the rest of her life carefully constructing. I am Mary, and today this channel is going to tell you what happened inside those hours. Not the version that became Camelot, the version that happened first. Stay with me. Before Dallas, before the motorcade, before the pink suit became the most recognizable garment in American history, there was a conversation on the morning of November 22 that Jackie Kennedy returned to for the rest of her life. What JFK said to her that morning, and what she said back, is coming. And it is the detail that makes everything that followed that afternoon almost unbearable to understand. The morning of the 22nd of November, 1963, began well. That is the specific, cruel detail that Jackie Kennedy carried with her for the rest of her life. Not that the day had been dark from the beginning, not that there had been a premonition or a warning or a conversation that suggested what was coming. The morning had been good. Jackie had been reluctant to make the Texas trip at all. She rarely traveled on political tours. The Kennedy political operation had its own rhythms and its own personnel, and Jackie had largely stayed outside of it, appearing when her presence was required and withdrawing when it was not. She had suffered a devastating personal loss earlier that year. Their son Patrick, born the 7th of August 1963, had died 2 days after his birth from a respiratory condition. She was still, in the truest sense, grieving. Jack Kennedy had asked her to come to Texas personally. He needed her beside him. Texas was politically complicated. There were tensions within the Democratic Party there that her presence could help smooth. She had agreed. And in Fort Worth, on the morning of November 22, something had shifted between them that the people around them noticed and remembered. They seemed closer. The loss of Patrick had done something to the marriage that the people closest to them described as a drawing together. The specific, private grief of losing a child, shared between two people who had also, in different ways, been living parallel rather than intertwined lives, had produced a tenderness between them that hadn't been as visible before. In Fort Worth that morning, JFK saw Jackie in the pink suit she had chosen for Dallas. He looked at her. He said, "You look great." Simple words. The people in the room remembered them because of what he said next. He looked at her again and said, "Nobody wonders what Lyndon's wife is wearing." She laughed. It was the last ordinary moment. The motorcade through Dallas had been arranged to maximize public visibility. The bubble top, the transparent protective covering on the presidential limousine, had been removed because the day was clear and sunny, and Kennedy wanted the crowds to see him. This decision has been examined by historians for 60 years. It did not cause what happened, but it is part of the specific, documented texture of a morning when small decisions were made that nobody knew they were making for the last time. The crowds in Dallas were larger than expected, warmer than expected, Kennedy remarked on them. Jackie, who had been nervous about Texas, who had been told it was hostile territory for a Kennedy presidency, was surprised by the welcome. She was holding roses, red roses. The traditional flower for Texas was yellow roses, and yellow roses had been presented to her at the airport. But someone along the motorcade route had given her red roses instead. She was holding them in her lap when the car turned onto Elm Street. The roses ended up covered in blood. At 12:30 p.m., the first shot was fired. And here is the specific, documented sequence of what happened in the following seconds, from the accounts of Jackie Kennedy herself, from Secret Service testimony, from the Zapruder film, from the Warren Commission record, because the sequence matters. Because understanding what she did requires understanding how fast it happened and what she was responding to in real time, with no preparation and no warning. The first shot, Jackie did not immediately understand what she was hearing. She turned toward Jack. He had been hit in the throat. He was clutching at it. He was still upright. Governor Connolly, sitting in front of them, was also hit. He screamed. Jackie turned toward the sound. The second shot, the fatal shot, came approximately 6 seconds after the first. 6 seconds. In 6 seconds, Jackie Kennedy went from holding red roses on a sunny Dallas afternoon to holding the pieces of her husband's head in her hands. 6 seconds. There is no preparation for 6 seconds. There is no composure that is adequate to 6 seconds. There is only the body responding to what the mind has not yet processed, and Jackie's body responded by reaching for him, holding him, refusing to let go of him, even when letting go was the medically indicated thing to do. The car accelerated toward Parkland. She did not scream. She said his name. Jack, Jack, Jack. 3 times, quietly, in the way of someone who does not yet believe what their hands are telling them. At Parkland Memorial Hospital, Jackie Kennedy was asked to wait outside Trauma Room 1 while the doctors worked on her husband. She stood in the corridor in a blood-soaked suit, with blood on her gloves and blood on her legs, and waited. And when the priest came out, when Father Oscar Huber told her what the doctors had already told her, she did something that has never been fully reported. What she asked for, what she refused, and what she did before she let anyone tell the world. That is coming. Parkland Memorial. The limousine arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital at approximately 12:38 p.m. 8 minutes. For 8 minutes, Jacqueline Kennedy had been holding her husband's head in her lap in the back of a moving car, surrounded by Secret Service agents, in a state that the medical literature would later describe as acute traumatic shock, but that in the moment simply looked like a woman who would not let go. At the hospital, the trauma team converged on the vehicle. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, with a gurney. The organized urgency of a medical facility that had been alerted to the severity of what was coming. They needed to move Kennedy from the car to the trauma room. Jackie would not release him. This is not a detail that was widely reported at the time. The coverage of November 22 focused on what was visible, the arrival at the hospital, the frantic activity, the waiting. What happened inside the car in those first moments at Parkland was documented in testimony and in the accounts of the medical personnel present, but it did not become part of the primary narrative of that day. What the accounts show is this. Jackie Kennedy was sitting in the back of the limousine with her husband's head in her lap. A nurse approached the car and asked her to release him so they could transfer him to the gurney. Jackie looked at her. She did not move. The nurse later described what she saw in Jackie's expression as not defiance, not hysteria, something more like incomprehension, as though the request was being made in a language Jackie understood intellectually, but could not yet process physically. It was Dr. Marion Jenkins, one of the Parkland physicians, who found a way through. He called for a sheet. He covered the president's body with the sheet before asking Jackie to release him. The covering gave her something to hold onto a boundary, a membrane between what her hands had been doing and what releasing him would require her to see. She released him. She followed the gurney inside. She stood in the corridor outside Trauma Room 1. And here is what the corridor looked like. Jackie Kennedy, 34 years old, in the pink Chanel suit she had chosen that morning because Jack had told her she looked great in it. The suit was soaked in blood. Her gloves were blood-soaked. There was blood on her stockings, on her shoes, on her face, in her hair. She had not been hit. None of the blood was hers. She stood in the corridor. Several people approached her and offered to help her clean up, to find her something else to wear, to take her somewhere more private. She declined each offer. She was going to wait. Lady Bird Johnson, the vice president's wife, arrived at the hospital and found Jackie in the corridor. She later recorded her impressions of that moment in her audio diary, which she kept throughout the events of November 22. Lady Bird described Jackie as quiet, still, looking, in Lady Bird's words, straight ahead. Lady Bird said, "I don't think I ever saw anyone so much alone in my life." Inside Trauma Room 1, the doctors were working. They knew, and had known from the moment the car arrived, that what they were working against was not survivable. The wound to the head was, in the language of the trauma surgeons, present non-survivable. They worked anyway, because he was the President of the United States, and you work anyway. Father Oscar Huber, a Catholic priest who had been summoned, administered the last rites. At approximately 1 p.m., 30 minutes after the shots were fired on Elm Street, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. Dr. George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, went to Jackie in the corridor. She already knew. She had known, in the way the body knows things before the mind catches up, since the moment in the car. But she listened to the doctor say the words, and then she asked to go in. She went into Trauma Room 1. She went to her husband's body. She kissed his foot. She kissed his hand. And then she did something that she would later say she regretted, not because of what it meant, but because of the practical difficulty it created. She removed her wedding ring. She slid it onto his finger. She wanted him to have it. In whatever comes after, she wanted him to have it. It was the specific, instinctive logic of acute grief, which does not operate according to practical considerations. The ring was retrieved later with some difficulty, with the help of Lady Bird Johnson. Jackie wore it again, but she had given it to him first. In the corridor, word began to spread. Kennedy was dead. The President of the United States had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The machinery of American government began to move. And at the center of all of it, standing in a blood-soaked pink suit in a hospital corridor in Dallas, was a 34-year-old woman who had not yet been given a moment to be anything other than the president's wife. She was about to make a decision that would define how the world remembered the next 24 hours. She was not going to change her clothes. On Air Force One, as Lyndon Johnson prepared to take the oath of office that would make him the 36th President of the United States, Jackie Kennedy was asked whether she wanted to be present for the swearing-in. She changed her mind at the last moment and walked in, still wearing the pink suit, still with the blood. And what she said in 4 words to the people who suggested she change first is the most deliberate and most powerful statement she made on the 22nd of November 1963. That is coming. Air Force One. Air Force One was on the ground at Love Field in Dallas. The body of John F. Kennedy, in a bronze casket that had been purchased at a Dallas funeral home and transported to Parkland Memorial in a hearse, needed to be loaded onto the plane. The flight back to Washington needed to depart. The new President of the United States needed to be sworn in. And Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had been Vice President for 3 years, and who was now, by the specific constitutional machinery of American governance, the President was not going to leave Dallas without taking the oath of office on American soil. There was a question about whether Jackie Kennedy would attend. Formally, she did not need to be present. The oath required a witness and a person to administer it. It did not require the widow of the man who had just been killed. Johnson asked. His staff asked. The request was communicated to Jackie through the layers of people now surrounding her. Her initial response was that she did not think she could do it, and then she changed her mind. She walked into the stateroom of Air Force One at approximately 2:38 p.m., still wearing the pink Chanel suit, still with the blood on the fabric, still with the blood on her gloves. Judge Sarah T. Hughes, who had been driven to Love Field to administer the oath, stood ready with a small Catholic missal that had been found on the plane, because a Bible could not be located quickly enough. Lyndon Johnson stood to her left. Lady Bird Johnson stood to his right. And Jackie Kennedy, the 34-year-old widow of the man whose blood was still on her clothing, stood next to Lyndon Johnson as he raised his right hand. The photograph taken at that moment is one of the most reproduced images in American history. Jackie is looking at Judge Hughes. Her expression has been described by everyone who has studied it, scholars, historians, people who were in the room, as impossible to read, not blank, not devastated, something more contained than either of those things. The expression of someone who has made a deliberate decision about what they are going to show the world and is keeping to it. Now here is the detail that Lady Bird Johnson recorded in her audio diary that evening. The detail that did not become widely known for years. The detail that answers the question of why Jackie Kennedy walked into that stateroom in a blood-soaked suit when she could have changed. When it was suggested to Jackie gently, by someone in her circle, that she might want to change her clothes before the swearing in, Jackie said, "No. I want them to see what they have done to Jack." 4 words after the no. I want them to see. This was not grief talking. This was not shock talking. This was a 34-year-old woman who had been performing the role of First Lady for 3 years, who understood better than almost anyone in that plane what images meant, what they communicated, what they made permanent, making a deliberate, conscious, specific decision about what the historical record of the 22nd of November 1963 was going to look like. She understood that the image of her in that suit, at that moment, would tell a story that no words could tell as efficiently. She was right. The photograph of the swearing in on Air Force One is, in large part, the visual history of the Kennedy assassination. The blood-stained pink suit is its most indelible detail. Jackie put it there deliberately. She kept the suit on for the flight back to Washington. She kept it on when the plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base and the cameras were rolling and Robert Kennedy pushed through the crowd to get to her before anyone else did. She kept it on through the early hours of November 23 until approximately 2 a.m., by most accounts, before finally changing. She wore it for 14 hours after the shots were fired, and then she folded it. The pink Chanel suit, with the blood still on it, with the blood never removed, with the specific, permanent evidence of what November 22 had done, was put into a bag and has been in the National Archives ever since. Jackie's family requested a 100-year embargo on displaying it. We will not see it in our lifetimes. It will be displayed, if the embargo holds, in 2103. Some historians have debated whether Jackie knew what she was doing, whether the decision to keep the suit was the calculation it appears in retrospect, or whether she was simply too deep in shock to process the practical considerations of changing. The answer to that question is, in some ways, everything you need to know about Jacqueline Kennedy. She knew. She always knew. That night in the White House, in the hours after the body arrived, and the children had been told, and the official machinery of mourning had begun, Jackie Kennedy sat down and wrote 2 letters, one to her husband, one to her children, telling them who their father was. Both letters were placed in the casket before it was sealed. The contents of those letters have never been made public, and never will be. But what we know about the night she wrote them and what she did after is the most private part of a day that the world has never stopped watching. That is coming. The letters. The body of John F. Kennedy arrived at the White House on the evening of November 22. Jackie had ridden with the casket in the hold of Air Force One, not in the passenger cabin, with the new president and his staff and the political personnel of an administration in transition, in the hold, with the casket. for the entire flight from Dallas to Washington. This is not a small detail. The hold of an aircraft is not a comfortable place. It is not the place where a First Lady would normally be expected to ride. But Jackie Kennedy had insisted, and the people around her had learned in the hours since 12:30 p.m. that insisting against Jackie's decisions on this day was not something that was going to produce results. She sat with him. At Andrews Air Force Base, the plane arrived to cameras and officials, and the ordered chaos of a government responding to the assassination of its president. Robert Kennedy was there. He had not been in Dallas. He had been at his home in Virginia when he received the call. He had come immediately. He boarded the plane before it had fully stopped moving. He moved through it, without stopping for anyone, through the compartment where the Johnson administration's new staff was assembling itself, through the aisle, to the back of the plane where the casket was, where Jackie was. What passed between them in those first moments when Robert Kennedy reached his sister-in-law has been described by the people who observed it as private in the most complete sense. The accounts that exist say that he took her hands, that they did not speak immediately, that whatever was communicated between them in those first moments was communicated in the way that the people who have shared the most specific kind of grief communicate without words, through the specific gravity of presence. The body was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy that the law required. Jackie went with it. She was offered sedatives at Bethesda. She declined. She was offered food. She declined or ate very little. She waited through the hours of the autopsy hours, in a room outside, while the medical and legal procedures that death in a position of power requires were carried out. The people who came to be with her during those hours described the same quality they had observed in the corridor at Parkland: still, present, refusing the sedation that would have made the hours softer. She wanted to feel it. That is the interpretation that the accounts suggest. She had made a decision, conscious or not, articulated or not, that she was not going to be medicated through this. She was going to be in it, all of it, without the pharmaceutical distance that the people around her kept offering. Late that night, after the autopsy, after the body was returned to the White House, after the casket was placed in the East Room, Jackie Kennedy went to her sitting room. She sat down. She wrote 2 letters. One letter was addressed to her husband. One letter was addressed to her children, Caroline, who was 5 years old, and John, who had turned 3 that very week, on November 25. The letter to her children told them who their father was. Not the president, not the historical figure. The man, the father, the specific, private, human person that she had known and that she wanted her children to know had existed before the mythology claimed him entirely. Robert Kennedy wrote a letter too. All 3 letters, Jackie's 2 and Robert's 1, were placed in the casket before it was sealed. They are still there, in the grave at Arlington National Cemetery, under the eternal flame that Jackie herself designed, in the casket that was sealed before the public funeral that Jackie herself planned. Those letters exist. We do not know what they say. We will never know what they say. And this specific, permanent privacy in the middle of the most public death of the 20th century is perhaps the most Jackie Kennedy thing in the entire story. She gave the world everything she was willing to give it, and she kept the rest. Now here is what happened the following day. Caroline and John Jr. were brought to see their father's casket in the East Room. Jackie had decided that her children needed to understand what had happened, not in an abstract way, not in the careful, sanitized language of protective parenting, but in the specific, physical, real way of being present at the casket of the father who would not be coming home. Caroline, who was 5 years old, knelt at the casket. She reached under the flag that covered it and touched it with her hand. Jackie watched her daughter do this and did not stop her. She understood that her daughter needed to touch it, to make it real, in the specific way that grief requires things to be real before it can begin its work. She was 34 years old. She was managing the grief of 2 children who were too young to understand what management means. And she was doing it while planning a state funeral. The funeral of John F. Kennedy was watched by approximately 180 million people on television, the largest audience in the history of American broadcasting to that point. Every detail of it, the riderless horse, the eternal flame, The march behind the coffin was Jackie Kennedy's decision. But the decision that nobody has ever fully examined is the one she made in the hours after Dallas that shaped everything the world saw on November 25. What she looked at for reference, what she rejected, and what she decided is coming. The funeral she planned. In the hours after she returned to the White House on the night of November 22, while she was still refusing sedatives, while the casket was being placed in the East Room, while the new administration was assembling itself in the offices around her, Jacqueline Kennedy asked for files. Specifically, she asked for the files on the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had been assassinated in 1865. His funeral had been a state occasion, the first presidential funeral of its kind, the model that all subsequent presidential funerals had drawn from to varying degrees. Jackie wanted to know what Lincoln's funeral had looked like, what decisions had been made, what the visual and ceremonial language of that specific kind of national mourning had established. She studied them. She was in acute traumatic shock. She had not slept. She had not eaten meaningfully. She was wearing borrowed clothes because the pink suit had finally come off. And she was studying the records of a 19th century state funeral at 2 a.m. because there was a funeral to plan, and she was going to plan it correctly. What Jackie Kennedy produced in the space of approximately 48 hours, working with a small team of White House staff and military protocol officers, was the funeral that the world watched on the 25th of November, 1963. Every significant detail of it was her decision. The riderless horse Black Jack, a black half-thoroughbred who famously fought the handler who tried to control him during the procession, whose riderless presence behind the coffin became one of the enduring images of the day Jackie's decision. The boots reversed in the stirrups, the military tradition, indicating a fallen warrior Jackie's decision. The march. This one requires a moment. The route from the White House to the Capitol, where the body would lie in state, and then from the Capitol to St. Matthew's Cathedral, and then from the Cathedral to Arlington National Cemetery is approximately 3 miles. The standard protocol for a presidential funeral would have been to transport the coffin by vehicle for the entire route. Jackie decided to march on foot, behind the coffin, for the full route. The security implications of this decision were enormous. The President of the United States had been assassinated 3 days earlier. His suspected killer had himself been shot and killed 2 days earlier. The security environment was, to use the mildest possible description, uncertain. The Secret Service was alarmed. Jackie marched. Approximately 100 world leaders marched with her: Charles de Gaulle, Haile Selassie, Prince Philip, the heads of government of countries that had been allies and adversaries of the Kennedy administration, walking through the streets of Washington behind a coffin because the widow of the dead president had decided that this was how it was going to be done. The television cameras were there. 180 million people watched. The eternal flame at Arlington, Jackie's idea. She had visited Arlington the previous year for a ceremonial event and had stood at the hillside below the Custis Lee mansion and said that the view was so beautiful she could stay there forever. She remembered it. In the planning of the funeral, she specified the site and she specified the flame. The eternal flame at the grave of John F. Kennedy has burned continuously since the 25th of November, 1963. It was the idea of a 34-year-old woman who had not slept in 3 days and who was planning the event from inside acute traumatic shock. And then, on the steps of St. Matthew's Cathedral, as the coffin emerged, 3-year-old John Kennedy Jr., who had been told that today was the day to salute his father, raised his small hand and saluted. The image went around the world. Jackie had not orchestrated the moment. She had told her son what the day meant. The salute was his own response to that telling. But Jackie understood in the instinctive, practiced way of someone who had spent 3 years performing the most public role in American life, what that image was going to mean. She let it happen. She did not pull him back. She understood that the world needed something to hold on to, that the specific, devastating fact of an assassinated president was going to be processed differently by a country that had an image to organize it around. She gave them the images, deliberately, one after another: the march, the flame, the child's salute. And then, 1 week after the assassination, she gave them something else, something that has shaped the way the Kennedy presidency has been understood ever since. 1 week after Dallas, Jackie Kennedy invited journalist Theodore White to the White House for an interview. She had requested him specifically. She had something she wanted to say. And what she said, the specific word she chose, the specific reference she made, the specific mythology she constructed in the space of a single conversation is the most effective act of narrative control in the history of American politics. That is coming. And once you understand it, you will never read about the Kennedy years the same way again. Camelot. 1 week after Dallas, on the evening of the 29th of November, 1963, Theodore White arrived at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. White was one of the most respected political journalists in America. He had written The Making of the President, 1960, the book that had chronicled Kennedy's election campaign and that had, in many ways, established the template for how American presidential campaigns were covered and understood. He was connected to the Kennedy world. He was trusted by it. Jackie had asked for him specifically. She had something she wanted to say. She talked to White for several hours that evening. She talked about Jack, about who he had been, what he had believed, what she wanted people to understand about him. She talked about the assassination. She talked about the days since. And then she said something that White later described as the moment the interview changed. She said that Jack had loved at the end of the day, before sleeping to listen to the cast recording of the musical Camelot. The Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe musical that had opened on Broadway in 1960, based on the Arthurian legend of the court of King Arthur. She said he particularly loved the final lines of the title song. She quoted them, "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot." And then she said to Theodore White, in the White House, 1 week after Dallas, that she did not want people to think of Jack's presidency as just another political administration. She wanted people to think of it as Camelot, as something that had existed briefly and brilliantly and been taken too soon, as a golden age. She looked at White and she said, "There will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot." White wrote it down. He filed his piece for Life magazine. The Kennedy years became Camelot. Now here is what this moment requires you to understand. Camelot is a legend. It is not history. The Arthurian legend is a story about a court that was perfect and brief and lost, and whose very perfection is dependent on its brevity. A Camelot that continued would have had to make compromises, would have had to deal with the mundane, grinding, unglamorous work of governing, would have had to confront its own contradictions. A Camelot that ended became eternal. Jackie Kennedy, 34 years old, 1 week out of Dallas, in a state of grief that the people around her described as barely functional, and yet somehow also entirely functional, understood this with a precision that most political strategists would not have been able to articulate. She turned the assassination into a myth. Not by lying, not by inventing things that had not happened, but by providing a frame, a single, resonant, culturally powerful frame that organized everything inside it according to a specific logic. The Camelot frame said, "This was extraordinary, and it was lost, and the loss is what confirms the extraordinariness." It was the most efficient piece of narrative construction in American political history. Theodore White knew what he was doing when he wrote it. He later reflected on that evening and said that Jackie had been, in his assessment, entirely deliberate about what she was saying, that she had invited him there with a specific purpose, that the Camelot framing was not a spontaneous, grief-driven outburst, but a carefully considered act by a woman who understood the power of the press and was using it with complete intentionality. She was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 1 week, and she had already decided how history was going to remember her husband. This is what the people who describe Jackie Kennedy as passive, as decorative, as a symbol rather than a person, consistently miss. She was never passive. She was strategic in a way that the world around her was not equipped to recognize as strategy because it was performed by a woman in a pillbox hat. The Camelot interview is not the footnote to the story of the 22nd of November 1963. It is the final act. Direct address. Let me tell you what this video has actually been about. It has been about a 34-year-old woman who, in the space of approximately 36 hours, did the following things. She held the pieces of her husband's head together with her bare hands in the back of a moving car. She refused to release his body at the hospital until she was given a way to do it that allowed her to maintain her dignity and his. She stood in a blood-soaked suit in a hospital corridor for 30 minutes and refused every offer of help because she was not finished yet. She removed her wedding ring and placed it on her dying husband's finger because she wanted him to have it. She attended the swearing-in of the new President of the United States in the clothes she had been wearing when her husband was killed, and when asked why, she said, "I want them to see what they have done to Jack." She refused sedatives through the night. She sat with the body in the hold of the aircraft on the flight back to Washington. She wrote 2 letters, one to her husband, one to her children, and placed them in the casket before it was sealed, where they remain. She planned the funeral from inside acute traumatic shock by pulling the files on Abraham Lincoln's funeral at 2 in the morning. She decided the route, the riderless horse, the reversed boots, the march, the eternal flame. She watched her 3-year-old son salute his father's coffin, and she did not pull him back because she understood what the image would mean. And then 1 week later, she called the most trusted political journalist she knew, and she gave history the frame it was going to use to understand John F. Kennedy forever. Now I want to ask you something. The world has spent 60 years describing Jacqueline Kennedy as the composed widow, the dignified First Lady, the woman who held it together, the symbol of American grace in the face of the unthinkable. But I want to propose that what she actually was, in those 36 hours, in those specific, documented decisions, was not composed. She was present. She refused every mechanism that would have put distance between her and what was happening. She refused the sedatives. She refused the change of clothes. She refused to leave the casket. She refused to be anywhere other than exactly where the grief required her to be. And then she built the myth, deliberately, consciously, with the specific, practiced intelligence of a woman who had spent 3 years learning exactly how the world processes what it sees. She gave the world Camelot. The world took it. And somewhere in the National Archives, in a box that will not be opened until 2103, there is a pink suit with blood on it that has not been cleaned. And somewhere in Arlington National Cemetery, under an eternal flame that has not gone out since the 25th of November, 1963, there are 3 letters that nobody will ever read. She kept the things that mattered private. She gave the world the things that served the story. And 60 years later, we are still living inside the story she made. Does it feel like history to you? Or does it feel like the most brilliant act of storytelling the 20th century produced? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this video showed you something you did not know about a woman you thought you knew, please share it. Because Jackie Kennedy has been the symbol for 60 years. This video was about the person. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.